and he's known for his work as a missionary. So there are two very different readings of Matteo Ricci. And certainly from the Chinese point of view, from the Chinese Catholic community's point of view, sure, there weren't a lot of converts when Ricci first planted seeds in China. But from the Chinese point of view, he was right in how he did it. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So that's interesting. Ricci first arrived in China in 1853. Well, he was in Macau before then, but he first went into the mainland in 1853. And when he arrived in China, basically Catholic Christianity hadn't been there since the 13th century, when the Franciscans were there and their mission died out, and they were really forgotten. Recently we have archaeological finds of tombs that are from basically in Middle China that were certainly from Italian Catholic families who were there and obviously had priests. So there are archaeological, there's evidence of this Franciscan mission that was earlier, but certainly when Ricci went there, he had no idea that was a part of China's historical past. And he also didn't know that there was an enormous Nestorian mission, Eastern Christianity, Syriac Christianity, that had been in China since the Tang Dynasty. So Ricci really felt like and thought that he was new. He was in China as a sort of pilgrim missionary, not a pilgrim missionary, but as really a trailblazer into this new mission field. Well, let me preface everything by a point of view that I think needs to be made when we think about Matteo Ricci. Who here's been to Rome? All right. If you've been to Rome, I think what I'm about to say might resonate with you. Imagine standing in Rome, maybe you're in St. Peter's, and you sort of leave through the piazza, and St. Peter's is behind you. Just sort of with your imagination, just sort of look from right to left and imagine all the churches that you'll see. I always think that Catholic churches in Rome is sort of like Starbucks in Seattle. It's true sometimes, and I'm not exaggerating, in Portland, Oregon, up on 23rd Avenue and up in Seattle, sometimes you'll find a Starbucks on every single corner. So I always think, how can they sustain that? But clearly there are enough Starbucks addicts to sustain that many Starbucks. But in Rome, there are churches everywhere. And what I like to think of is, if I were to walk through Rome and take very special note of all of the Christian monuments, the churches and the monuments, and the art that was produced in Rome by Catholics, and then close my eyes and imagine that everything Christian were to disappear at that moment, and open my eyes again, how much of Rome would be left? Now, I'm a devoted Catholic. I'm a catechism Catholic, so I tell people to try, because many of my friends describe themselves as cafeteria Catholics, or all these sort of various levels. I'm loyal, but at the same time, I've lived in China enough to realize that if you were to walk through China, and Ricci did too, if you were to walk through China and see all of the Buddhist temples, and the Taoist temples, and the popular temples dedicated to tutelary spirits, and the temples dedicated to certain Confucian aspects that aren't necessarily purely Confucian. That is, Song Dynasty Confucianism was an admixture of Buddhism and Taoism, and certainly there were supernatural aspects of Confucianism, certainly after the Song to a certain degree. But if you were to walk through China and look at its greatest monumental history, and close your eyes, anything pagan has to go, and open your eyes, where would China be? And the Chinese anxiety, the largest anxiety that the Chinese had about Christian missionaries, well, they had several anxieties, but one of their largest anxieties was, well, what happens to our culture if our country becomes Christianized? What happens to our temples that are our pride if they become obsolete? What happens to our identity as Chinese people? So Ricci knew this. And he knew that the process of converting China to Christianity had to be more like leaven and less like a bulldozer. He also knew that in Macau, beforehand, before he went into China in 1583, he knew that in Macau, to be a baptized, confirmed Catholic meant you had to become European. you had to basically, the missionaries before Ricci, before Valignano, and before Ruggieri, for them it didn't really, learning Chinese wasn't really important. But Ricci understood that how can we convert a country if we can't speak their language? And not just their language, but if we have to understand their culture and the way they think. It's very different for those of us, by the way, who here is bilingual? Fluently bilingual. I don't know, do you think differently in the other language? No?
Too much like English.
Too much like English? Okay. Well, in Chinese, if I were to say, in English, if I were to say something like, that it was a trap. I went to a meeting and I was entrapped by it. In Chinese, you don't say that. You say, it was, how do we say, Hongmen Yan. It was like the banquet of the Phoenix Gate. Typical Chinese figure of speech. How do you translate that? If you just translate, I went to a meal last night, it was like the banquet of Phoenix Gate. It alludes back to a Han Dynasty moment where a ruler was entrapped by another ruler, and he had to feign a need to use the restroom when he escaped. But in a sense, the Chinese language is so amazingly different, and Ricci understood this. You actually think differently. Even my wife says I'm married to two people, my husband in Chinese and my husband in English. And really I don't feel like two different people, but certainly even my mannerisms change in Chinese. So it's a vastly different culture. So this was what Ricci really faced. He faced an understanding that the Macau ideal of bringing Chinese people to Catholicism equaling bringing Chinese people to Europeanism, Ricci knew that didn't quite work. Ricci was also savvy. He also knew that there were more than just Latin Christians. There were Eastern Christians. And if you've ever been to the Divine Liturgy, the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom or the Liturgy of St. Basil the Great, you know that it's very different than the Roman Rite. Well, the pre-conciliar Roman Rite was probably more like the Divine Liturgy than it is today. So we have even a wider gap. But fundamentally, Ricci knew that even within our Christianity that he was aware of, there were variances. And Jesus wasn't an Italian. That was something he was aware of. So for him, he didn't want to make Chinese Europeans. He wanted to make China Christian. He wanted to make China Catholic. So that's the first thing I want to, that's the sort of by way of opening my talk. Let me begin too by just bringing up an interesting account. In 1600, 1601, Matteo Ricci was approaching Beijing. Because for Matteo Ricci, he understood that China is a very hierarchical society. And incidentally, in China today, let me make this point, and this is one of the most important points I want to make tonight. Even in the patriotic church, the priests, I would argue, I'm going to say this, and I'll probably be in trouble for saying this, are probably, by and large, more loyal to the Pope in a more profound way than many of the priests that I know who are personal friends, who I meet on a regular basis as I work in the chancery. So, and that largely is because of this notion of hierarchy and acceptance that hierarchy is natural. Confucius said, "Chen chen fu fu," "Chen chen jun jun, chen chen fu fu zi zi." That is, when a ruler is a ruler, and a minister is a minister, when a parent is a parent, and a child is a child, the world will work. We have to exist in our roles. So Ricci understood that. And understanding that, Ricci went to the capital to convert, well, the emperor. If Europe had a Constantine, well, China needed a Constantine too. So Ricci went to the capital to convert the emperor, and, well, he assumed, and I think correctly, that if the emperor would be converted, then China would much more easily be converted to Christianity. Well, as he's making his way to the capital of China in Beijing, he was intercepted in a small town near the port city of Tianjin. And as he's intercepted, he is taken and placed into confinement with his fellow confreres. And the person who intercepted him was one of the court eunuchs by the name of Ma Tang. And in Ricci's private journals, he writes about this event. And this event will shift how he thinks about functioning in China as a missionary and what the best approach